Hi everybody, it's great to be back here again. Tomorrow's Friday, Parashat Eykev. I'd like to open up this lesson with a comparison in last week's portion. There is seemingly a contradiction between this week's portion and last week's portion. If we go back to last week's portion in chapter 7 and verses 1 through 8, the Torah talks about when God will bring us to the land and how He will push aside the nations and we will inherit the land of Israel, and how we're not supposed to make a covenant with them, and then and how we have to separate ourselves from intermarriage, and then God commands us to eliminate the idol worship in the land. And afterwards, God explains in verse number 6 in chapter 7 in Deuteronomy, God says, "Ki am kadosh ata l'Hashem Elokecha," because you are a holy nation to the Lord your God, and I've chosen you to be a treasured nation from all the nations on earth. So God is saying right there that He chose us to be a treasured nation from all nations on earth, and explains in the next verse, why did God choose us? Like, it's a great question. Why does God choose the nation of Israel to be His chosen people? And God goes on to say, Lo merubchem mikol hamim, not because of your numbers that God desired you and He chose you, because you're really the smallest of all the nations. So why did God choose us? So verse number 8, the answer is given. It says, because ki ma'avat Hashem etchem, because the love that God has for you, for His people, that's why He chose us. And He goes on to say also, and He's also protecting the covenant, the oath that was made to our forefathers. So this explanation that we see in last week's portion is very clear. We just go, why did God choose the people of Israel? Why are we the chosen people of the world? Because God loves us, and He promised to the forefathers. Okay, so if we go quickly to this week's portion, and we look in chapter 9, in verse number 4 to 6, we see something a little different perhaps. And this is what it says, Al tomar bilvavcha, don't say in your hearts, Badof Hashem Elokecha otam milefanech, when God pushes away the nations from the land, Leimor b'tzidkati aviyani Hashem lireshet et haaretz. You shouldn't pat yourself on the back and say, because of my righteousness, God brought me to the land. U'berishat hagoyim, and because of the evilness of the goyim, of the nations, God inherits the land of Israel to Israel. He gives the land to us as inheritance. We shouldn't say that. And verse number 5 says, Lo b'tzidkata, no, not because of your righteousness and your straightness of your hearts, u'biyosher levavcha, you come to inherit the land, because of the evilness of the nations, God is bringing you the land. And number 2, for the oath that He set up with the covenant with our forefathers. And then it stresses it again in verse number 6. V'yadata, you should know, ki lo b'tzidkatcha, not because of your righteousness God gives you the land, right, to inherit, ki am kshe'ofata, because you're a stubborn nation. So the Torah seems to be sort of giving us a criticism, a serious criticism, that we didn't inherit the land because that we are righteous, but because we're stubborn and we don't deserve it. But in any case, God gave it to us because the nations are so bad that God had to get rid of them. And of course, His promise to the forefathers. And this seems to be a contradiction to the opening of, what I opened up the lesson with in last week's portion, where God says, because God loves us, not because of our numbers, we're tiny numbers, but God loves us from all the nations of the world. That seems a little strange, right? And this question, it was really bothering me. Of course, how can we resolve the answer? What the answer is? And I was thinking about some different directions, and lo and behold, I found one of the great commentaries. He's not so known, but he's very well known for his commentary on Mishnah, but less known on his commentary on the Bible. And this commentary is called the Baal Tanua. The Baal Tanua is a very famous rabbi that was born in Baal Tanua, northern Italy, and he came to Jerusalem. He was born in 1440, and he settles in Jerusalem. He sets up a great congregation in Jerusalem, where he passes away in 1510. And again, I said he's very well known for his commentary on the Mishnah. And he says like this, and he brings down the question that I just said. He said, Kasher, this is difficult. Before God said He chose us because He loves us, right? And therefore, He says, if we are loved before God, it means that we are tzaddikim, we are righteous, right? If God loves us, because He says, why would God love us if we're not righteous, right? God doesn't like the evil, He likes the righteous people. So he's saying, V'yesh lomar, so we have to answer it, V'hata ma'ir lechol Yisrael, b'klal shekadosh baruch hu bota. So he's saying a very, very simple answer, which is a very powerful answer. He's saying, well, what is the difference? If God chose us because He loves us, it must mean that we're righteous. So why does it say in this week's portion, I didn't choose you because you're righteous, but because they were so bad, and I chose, and my oath to the forefathers. He says, we have to talk, there are two things here. Last week's portion, it was a general focus on Israel, God's chosen people. God loves His people, right? And that's the rule. He loves the nation, He chose the nation of Israel. But this week's portion, with that particular mentioning that God is throwing out the nations, not because He's righteous, because they're so evil, and for His promise to the forefathers, it refers to that particular generation of the desert that did a lot of bad things, right? The Moshe Rabbeinu was talking about the desert generation, and they weren't even merited in entering the land, most of them. It was their children, but He was giving the reproof of their behavior that went on in the desert. So God blessed their children. I think the children were young, that generation didn't sin yet. But their fathers didn't have too many good things to talk about what they did in the desert. The sin of the spies, all the sins that were the sin of the calf, all these terrible sins that went on over there. And therefore, when God said, not be for your righteousness, He's referring to the way they behaved in the time of the desert. This is what the Baal Tanur explains. But in reality, he opened up a tremendous topic over here. And I'd like to mention a couple of different directions. One basic direction, but it's a very important foundation in our faith to understand. And Rav Kook, and I'll open up by the words of Rav Kook. Rav Kook says something very profound. And he writes this in one of his letters called Igeret Takana. And Rav Kook writes like this. He says, Shnei dvarim ikariyim yeshnam shehem yachad bonim kedushat Yisrael. Rav Kook says there are two things together that build the holiness of the people of Israel. V'tkashrut elokit imahem, and that special relationship with God connects with them. The first one he's saying is called Sgula. That's called the treasure that God chose Israel as a chosen people. And what does it mean to be a chosen people? He explains. Kilomar teva hakdusha shebenishmat Yisrael. He said in Israel's soul there's a natural. It's like in our DNA, in our souls, is a holiness from Yehushat Avot, from what we inherited from our forefathers. That really hints to what Rav Kook is saying over here in the verse, not because of the love, because of your forefathers, but it's going back to that sgula, to that special treasure of inheritance that we receive from our forefathers, is something innate in our DNA. And that's what Rav Kook says, Lo b'sitkadcha, not because of your righteousness. Rak bavotecha chashak Hashem, but God desired, He had this desire for you, lava otam, to love them, v'yivchal b'zaram achem, He chose their children. So this particular choice of God here was because of His love for us, something that goes way, very, very, very deep before creation even, goes all the way back to our forefathers, something in the upper worlds. As it says, Rav Kook continues to write, V'item li sgula mikol amim, you will be a chosen nation for all nations. V'sgula u'koch kadosh. And Rav Kook is saying, what does it mean to be chosen? That's a very holy, powerful inner force, which is munach b'teva nefesh, which is placed within our souls in God's will. K'mo teva kol davar me'ametziut, like something natural and a thing in reality. It's part of nature. And he says here, Rav Kook says, Yefshar lo lishtanot klal, it cannot change at all. Ki hu amav, it says God said and it was, just like when God said, let there be light. When the world was created, God said, let there be Israel. The world was created for Israel. So here we see Rav Kook is saying there's something that we can't understand it rationally. It's something way beyond our rational understanding. It's something so deep that goes way back, this chosenness of the people of Israel. And then Rav Kook goes on to say, is the next level is the fact that God, the part that we are treasured was the first thing, that God chose us, and goes beyond our understanding, because we are the sgula, God's treasure. And the second aspect is Rav Kook saying, is called bechira. Bechira means to choose, right? What does it mean to bechira? We have free will, free choice. Zeh talui b'maaseh tov u'b'talmud Torah. The other aspect which makes up Israel, he's saying, is our behavior. Our behavior, how we behave, how we act according to our deeds. Right? And he's saying, B'maseh tov, how do we behave with our good deeds and our studying Torah? החלק של הסגולה הוא הרבה באין ארוך כלל, יותר גדול וקדוש מהחלק התלוי בבחירה, אלא שברית כרותה. He's saying, Rav Kook is saying that the aspect which refers to our being God's chosen nation, the sgula, the treasure, is something that's way beyond the choice that when we choose to learn Torah and we choose to behave properly. The sgula goes way beyond that. He's saying שהסגולה הפנימית לא תתגלה בזמן הזה. כי אם לפי אותה מידה שהבחירה מסייעה את הגילויה. I'm going to say something very fascinating. The sgula is something way beyond the fact that our free will that we can choose to behave properly and do the proper things. But that's part of our aspect as human beings, and of course as the nation of Israel that God chose us. We also have to behave properly, to do the right things. But Rav Kook says our inner innate sgula, our treasure that He shows us, that God, because of our sgula, that goes beyond our rational understanding, that's something way beyond the bichira, the aspect of our free choice that we have to choose to do so, to be righteous, etc. And Rav Kook goes on to say, is that, but in order to reveal our inner essence, who we are, Rav Kook says in our time, it has to go through our bechira, through our choice. So in other words, if we are going to behave properly and we're going to do the things that we have to do, so then we're going to reveal our inner essence, who we are, that goes way beyond our choices. Rav Kook goes on to say, Al koch hakol tului lefi rov ha'maseh, and therefore everything depends upon our actions, u'kedusha, ha'emunah v'talmud Torah, and our faith and our studying Torah. V'Hashem yitbarach hanoheg b'chasto b'chol dor, and God who relates to every generation with love, misadehu et sidrei ha-neshamot, He organizes the different neshamot, hatzrichot lofia b'olam, that have to come down to the world. Lefamim koach ha-bechira mitgaber, sometimes we see that the koach bechira is dominant. In other words, you see a generation where a lot of people aren't choosing the right path and doing the right thing, and the koach hasgula umeid b'matzav elein, and then we see that the koach hasgula is hidden, right? In other words, we see that those who behave righteousness in the world, that the aspect of doing the right thing in the world, that takes that's obviously that is something that grabs our attention when people do the right thing and behave properly in the world. But they don't realize that behind all that, when Am Yisrael behaves properly and does the right thing, the koach hasgula is actually behind that. That is really pushing us from behind who we are in our innate essence, right? But it's not revealed, right? So sometimes we're going to see, I want to finish what he says, then I'm going to clarify things. Ulefamim koach hasgula mitgaber, and sometimes we see the opposite. We see a situation where God is revealing our innate treasure that He chose us, and the koach b'cha is hidden. And Rav Kook is really hidden. I don't want to go into all the details, but in this letter he's writing a letter as a response about the sabbatical year, giving a heter, a permit to sell the land during the sabbatical year so they could work the land. I'm not going to go into all the details. And there was a Haredi rabbi, the Gidbaz, who was very anti Rav Kook's decision, and as a chief rabbinate, to make a decision to sell the land, and because the land was going through starvation. Rav Kook found reasons, and one of the things that came up through this conversation was, how do we relate to those who are not orthodox and those who are going against the Torah? It was a very terrible, very difficult time during Rav Kook's time. There were a lot of people that were totally secular, and we have it today, but today it's a different situation than it was then. And Rav Kook was trying to teach that there's another side to the people of Israel that goes beyond our behavior, our righteous behavior as fulfilling the commandments. It's something that God chose His nation no matter what. And even people that are not fulfilling the Torah the way they should, eventually we will see from their children, who knows what will come out of the children, what kind of great people that will return to the faith. And we can't, and you have to realize there are a lot of good sides to the people that came and they did important things in drying up the swamps and building the land. There were good sides to those people that did good things, but they weren't yet returned to the faith. But Rav Kook was trying to find, was to show that there's another side of the picture, and that these people, although they're externally not fulfilling what they should do, in their inner essence, there's something very, very deep and powerful that's going to be revealed eventually, and that we have to be aware of that. So this is where the lesson Rav Kook was teaching, and he goes on to say over there. I'm just going to end with the last part that I decided to quote here. He's saying, talks about the covenant with our forefathers that never ends. Although that maybe the merit has ended, but the covenant, God's oath to our forefathers, will never end. And therefore, that comes from the sgula, that comes from the inner treasure, who we are as a people. And Rav Kook says, during Messianic times is where we're going to see an enhancement of this powerful, powerful force of the koach hasgula, of the treasure. God choosing us not because of our deeds, but more because of who we are in our inner essence, wanting to fulfill the promise of our forefathers, revealing that greatness of Israel. So this is a very, very important teaching of Kook, and that's exactly fits into what we began. We opened the class up with, and we saw the contradiction. One side, this is how I would like to relate. Of Kook is obviously answering the question, is that when we look at the opening where God loves us who we are, and He chose us for with our forefathers, that connection, obviously He's referring to the sgula, that God loves His people unconditionally, and who we are in our essence, and eventually that will be revealed who we are, right? And the other side, in the portion which Menson talks about that God, not because of our righteousness, God chose us, but because of the problem with the oath to our forefathers. Obviously, that was connecting to the essence who we are inside. But besides, it mentions because of the evil of the nations, that has to do with the chosen, the bichira, the freedom of choice. When the nations were so bad, so God didn't have to give Israel the land at that time, but God did give it to us at that time, and that could have been that was dependent partly on our behavior as opposed to the nation's behavior. So God was saying, okay, the nations were a lot worse. I'm giving you the land, but of course, because I'm also connecting to the inner treasure that you are, that go back to the forefathers. But we see there is so on a daily basis we have to deal with. Obviously we have to do the right thing in the world, but there are things that are so like rules of the way God created the world that go beyond all that, and that's really what the sgula is. And I want to show you. This teaching is a fascinating teaching that's brought down by the Maharal of Prague. The Ramban, Nachmanides, asks a great question in the Torah when we look in the book of Genesis. And when Parashat Lech Lech, we see that God just tells Abraham to go to the land I show you. And the Ramban, Nachmanides, asks the question, why doesn't it mention before that God tells Abraham to go to the land I'm going to show you, to mention Abraham's righteousness? The way the acts he did, why what he did that made God choose him, etc., to go to the land. It doesn't say one word about Abraham in his righteousness. Although we know he was so righteous, in every way, so kind and so good, Abraham, and he fought against idol worship. There are so many things brought down, but the Torah doesn't tell us about that, and that's the question that Nachmanides asks. And he gives his own answer there, which at time I would go there too and explain in details. There's just so much, these teachings I try to give you just a little taste, but obviously they require many, many hours of study to learn slowly and detailed of what's here. It's just like an endless reservoir. But I want to mention particularly because is the Maharal of Prague. Maharal of Prague was a great giant, as I mentioned many, many times in our lessons. And the Maharal has a very, very beautiful explanation. He was from Prague, we all know. He lived, as a matter of fact, not long after the Baal Tanua. He lived pretty close in time to the Baal Tanua in the following generation. He was born around 1520 or so. So anyway, I'd like to mention his words. And he has a very fascinating teaching. And he brings down the Ramban's words and the question that the Nachmanides asked about why doesn't it talk about Abraham's righteousness. And he said something so fascinating, I'd like to quote what he says. And he says like this. He says, "Ki etzel Noach lo haya rak bechira prati." When Noah, right, because what was the question of the Nachmanides, was that we see regarding Noach, or Noah in English, we see that the Torah says he was a ish tamim, tzaddik tamim haya b'dorotav, he was a righteous man in his generation. So there the Torah explains about Noah, why he was merited in being saved from the flood. So the Maharal writes like this, he says, because by Noah, we're talking about a personal aspect. That was bechira prati. It was a personal choice. As we said before, Rav Kook spoke about two different sides. The bechira, the side of choice, choosing to behave properly, and then the side of skula, being chosen by God chooses us, not because of our choices, but by God's choice of who we are in our essence, in our inner spiritual makeup. So he's saying by Noah, it was his choice, Noah's choice to behave properly. B'chira pratit ulefishu mashu, and he chose to be a good individual, etc. And because of that, of course, he was saved, and he saved, the humanity for that time, what he did. But that act that Noah did was a personal choice. It was on a personal level. But he's saying, Avraham lo haya bechira pratit. But it's Abraham, he's saying, Avraham Avinu, it wasn't a personal choice. Rak be'umah ha'yisraelit. It was the nation of Israel, he's saying. Shehem zaro, that they're God's seed, right? When in God's seed. Shehem zaro shel Avraham, Abraham's seed, which is God's choice, right? The nation of Israel is Abraham's progeny, which God chose. God chose that progeny, that people of Israel. Sharei ketiv b'ota b'chira. What does it say regarding Abraham? When God chose him, ve'escha l'goy gadol, I will make you a great nation. And that, the Maharal says, v'zeh b'chira klalit. That is choosing, not a personal choice, because of your righteous behavior getting chosen, but God choosing us because of something in our inner makeup, our spiritual makeup, which is called something klali in Hebrew. Klali means general. It's something that's much greater, much more inclusive than something prati, something individual. That kind of choosing, when God shows us as being His treasure, does not depend on any deed, the Maharal says. It's not all connected to sinning. Because when you talk about sinning and doing good, that's all individual. That's connected to personal choices. Of course, the merit of our forefathers helps us, of course. But nevertheless, he's saying, but the choice was God choosing Abraham and his progeny, right? God chose Abraham and the children of Israel. So he's saying, don't ask the question what it says in our portion, Eykev lo b'tzidkacha ata ba'al hareshet, not because of your righteousness you're coming to inherit the land, because I am establishing the oaths of the forefathers. He's saying, b'vadai davar zeh ma she'hivii oto ador el haaretz hitoleh b'zchut avot, because what brought that particular generation to the land that's connected to our forefathers, to the merit. But he's saying that was, which I mentioned before, is exactly in lines of the Baal Tanura. I've always said before from the great rabbi from Italy, which before the time of the Maharal, he said this before the Maharal is expanding really what he said. But the choice of Abraham wasn't a personal choice. But God chose a bechira klalit, a general choice, in other words, who we are and our makeup and our much greater than a personal level. Maharal goes on and taking this from different sides. A personal choice is by the receiving end, how we behave, correct? If the person changes, so the thing changes. And therefore, this answers the question where what God doesn't mention, to Abraham, he just says, go to the land I'm going to show you, etc. And he doesn't say, he says, leave your father's house, go to the land I'm going to show you. And he doesn't mention in any way the reasons why he merited this. Because the point here was that this choice was something that doesn't depend on anything but God's love, choosing Israel, something so innate that we can't explain even. It's beyond rational. That Israel is the apple of God's eye. And this is what the Maharal of Prague in his very profound ways, explaining Rav Kook, in the same lines of Rav Kook, explaining the both ways that there are two sides to choose on the personal level and then the general level of who we are as a people. Now this understanding is so important to bring home because right now what goes on in Israel, and we see what's happening in the war, and we're surrounded by the nations of etc., etc. And this particular challenge that we have, obviously there is these two sides, as Rav Kook described before. There are different in different times of history. Sometimes we see the skula side more standing out, and other times we see the personal level standing out, and sometimes there's a combination of them. And that's really what's going on today. Today, we see a combination, of course. We always see the combination as the land of Israel gets stronger and we're building our homeland here in the land. And we're seeing more and more the nation of Israel is revealing who we are. So we're seeing, of course, the skula in a tremendous way. But of course, at the end of the day, as Rav Kook said before, everything reflects on our personal behavior for our generation. So if we want to make things move quicker in our generation and bring that redemption process forward, we have to, of course, work and perfect our personal ways, making the proper choices. Otherwise, eventually, the redemption is going to come, no matter what. But we want to make it happen faster. We have to, of course, work hard. It's not like, okay, the fact that God chose us, we have to do nothing. No, we have to work on our personal level. And that's when we see all the suffering, unfortunately, the things that are happening around us is only because of our personal, the way our generation is behaving. Each generation could make a big difference and depends on our behavior. So if obviously God will never forget his nation no matter what, and Israel will always survive. That has to do with this gula, that God chose us no matter what. And that's the fact that we are indestructible. Israel will always be here. But on a personal generation that we will merit in less suffering and more suffering, that depends on our personal activity as a nation. What is our generation? How is our generation behaving? And this very, very important lesson we have to take to heart, to realize it's within our ability to eliminate the terrible suffering of what's going on of those in captive and the enemy is lifting their heads up. We have to make a spiritual change of who we are and realizing what is this chosenness that God shows us. What is special, unique about the people of Israel? We're people of a prophecy, a nation of light, to bring light to the world, and that has to, we have to reveal that inner aspect of who we are. Now, some of these things are reflected. I'd like to maybe mention just a little bit of them. I mean, in the Midrash, I don't want to overextend time, but I would like to mention, I'll mention this Midrash. It's a beautiful Midrash that Rav brings down. One of the rabbis, the Amoraim, says, Yakim Shlosha Chatzufim Hem. Amar Rav Yakim. I've decided to correct the name. The name is Rav Yakim, which is very interesting, because the word Yakim means to establish. But this particular Midrash says, Amar Rav Yakim. Okay? Rav Yakim says like this. Shlosha Chatzufim Hem. There are three brazen things. Three brazen things that God created. What are the three brazen things? Chatzuf, Bachaya, Kelev. If we look in the animal kingdom, what is brazen amongst the animals? A dog. If you look in the bird kingdom, Ba'of, in the bird kingdom, it's a chicken, Tanagol. And if you look in the nations, Be'umot, Yisrael, the nation of Israel. So Rav Yakim is saying that Israel is stubborn, that the fact that we are stubborn, we have chutzpah. This stubbornness, this brazenness is something, it's a quality of Israel. And that's what Rav Yakim is mentioning. Now, Amar Yitzchak Bar Redifa, one of the rabbis that Amoraim say, Hashem Rav Ami, Ata savor shu le'genai? You think that this is, genai means this is something derogatory? It's in a bad way, calling Israel chatzuf, that Israel is very brazen? He's saying no. Eino ela lishivcha, and this is really trying to show our praise. How is it showing our praise to Israel? O Yehudi, O Tzaluv. Fascinating, remember this statement. He's saying, O Yehudi, or you're a Jew, or you're hung up. What does that mean? That a Jewish person is so powerful because they're so brazen in that way, and they're stubborn in that way. Not brazen, God forbid, and they're the opposite. They're very modest people, but they're very stubborn. The word chatzut means to be sometimes brazen in a stubborn way, not to be able, not to be so easily taken in by different things. Being very stubborn to standing your way. So he's saying the Jewish people. This is a praise for us because why? We all know the Jewish people will rather be killed, hung, than give up their Judaism. When it comes to a point when the nations of the world are trying to say, you will change your religion. We saw how many Jews throughout history have literally went into the firing inquisitions. They weren't willing to change their faith to Christianity throughout the ages. We've seen this with idol worshippers that try to make Israel worship idols in the past generations. And Israel has always given their life, what we call Mesilat Nefesh. Oh, Yehudi o Tzaluv, we choosing our Judaism, and even the Jews far away, at the end when it comes to reveal the inner sense, who they are, they're revealing that God shows us who we are in our DNA, who we are, and inside our spiritual makeup is that we're willing to give our lives for the sake of who we are as our Torah, our spirituality, our religion, who we are as a people. And we're not willing to in any way give that up. And we're willing to die for it. And that is something, when we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, every day we just say God is one. We have these intention. Everyone has to think about, God forbid, if a Jew has to give his life. So he will give his life for the sake, the oneness of God, who we are as a people. And that is something that is not rational in any other nation but Israel. And that exactly describes our Zgula, who we are as a people. That's the Zgula, and that's really what, many people said in October 7th, when these terrible tragedies took place, what made them make the change, to their becoming more orthodox and wanting to study more about their Judaism, was seeing how the hatred towards Israel and who we are as a people, reminding us who we are and our inside, who we are as a people of Israel. This has caused a big revolution in the land. You see so many people wanting to study more about who they are, returning to their roots, those who chose to see the truth. And there's the other side, which is very difficult, that we see a lot of the elements in the country, and that is the minority, and that has to do, we said before, people make choices, and they can choose. And since they're Jewish and they make a choice, and we spoke about the stubbornness and going the other way, and then go in a way of being very, very stubborn and very making grave mistakes who they are. And on their, again, it's a personal choice, and they will pay the price for that. God will not let anyone get away with choosing evil. But as a rule on the whole, Israel will succeed, and we will go forward, and we will overcome our enemies, and we will build the house of Israel here in the land. We will merit to see our temple restored, and life in Israel will be a blessing to all. As the beautiful verse in Malachi, in chapter 3, verse 12 says, V'ishru etchem kol hagoyim, ki tiyu atem eretz chefetz, amar Hashem tzvakot. All the nations basically will praise Israel at the end of days, saying, when they see our tremendous success, they will say, and what are the words? Because it says, Ki tiyu atem eretz chefetz, because the prophet's saying, we will be the land of chefetz. What is the land of chefetz? Your land will be the land that will fulfill all our desires as a people. Everything will be fulfilled in the land of Israel. Everything will flourish and come to life, and through our temple and through our building the land, and our agriculture in all ways. And the nations will praise Israel at the end, and that's what's going to happen. Shabbat Shalom, B'sarot Tovot, Yeshuot V'nechama.